The Lost Colony of Roanoke. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to one of those oddly comforting historical mysteries, the kind where absolutely nothing was resolved, everyone made baffling decisions, and the only certainty is that it all ended badly. Perfect bedtime material, so settle in. Maybe dim the lights, let your shoulders relax. If you're lying in bed, feel the weight of the blankets pressing gently down. Tonight, we're going to talk about the Lost Colony of Roanoke. A story that begins with grand Elizabethan ambition, continues with poor planning, and concludes with, well, nothing at all, which honestly is rather fitting for a colony that managed to become famous precisely by disappearing. Now, if you've ever heard about Roanoke before, you'll know the one word that defines it. CROATOAN, carved into a post, left behind as the only clue by an entire vanished colony. Historians have argued about it for centuries, but, as with most things from the late 16th century, it was probably less mysterious than we like to imagine. Still, the name The Lost Colony stuck, because of course it did. No one wants to fund a documentary about the colony that probably just moved somewhere slightly else. But let's drift back to where it all started, to the late 1500s. England was under Queen Elizabeth I, who loved poetry, pageantry, and, above all, irritating Spain. Spain had been scooping up land in the Americas like a child pocketing candy, and England, naturally, wanted some of that sweet overseas prestige. Never mind that England had neither the money nor the naval capacity to really pull it off. That never stopped them before. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh. A man remembered mostly for throwing his cloak over a puddle for the Queen, although, disappointingly, that story is almost certainly invented. In reality, Raleigh was less about gallantry and more about opportunistic ambition. He wanted to plant an English colony in North America. For glory, for profit, and, let's be honest, for bragging rights, Elizabeth granted him a patent to explore and colonize remote heathen and barbarous lands, which is a very Elizabethan way of saying anywhere that isn't already claimed by Spain or France, or at least not claimed loudly. The catch was that Raleigh himself wasn't allowed to actually go. Elizabeth liked him too much to risk him dying of dysentery in a swamp. So Raleigh did what any well-connected courtier would do. He outsourced. The first attempt came in 1585. A small fleet led by Sir Richard Grenville landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what's now North Carolina. It was a beautiful spot. Sandy shores, thick woods, plenty of mosquitoes. The English did what the English always did when they arrived somewhere new. They annoyed the locals immediately. In this case, the CROATOAN and CROATOAN tribes. Relations began badly, then somehow managed to get worse. At one point, Grenville burned down a native village because he suspected someone there had stolen a silver cup. Yes, a silver cup. The colonists would later struggle to feed themselves, but at least no one could say they hadn't avenged the loss of their tableware. The settlement limped along under the leadership of Ralph Lane, a man best described as cranky, paranoid, and deeply unsuited for building community spirit. Lane spent most of his time demanding food from local tribes and executing those he didn't trust, which conveniently was nearly everyone. Unsurprisingly, the whole venture collapsed. By 1586, when Sir Francis Drake stopped by after a successful raid in the Caribbean, the colonists were so desperate that they begged him for a ride home. Drake, who had a soft spot for stranded Englishmen, agreed, and just like that, the first colony at Roanoke ended. Of course, when Raleigh sent a supply ship later that year, they found the place empty. The relief crew left a few men behind to hold the fort, but those men promptly disappeared too. A pattern was emerging. Roanoke was becoming less a colony and more a revolving door of English incompetence. Still, Raleigh wasn't ready to give up. Failure, after all, was just an obstacle on the road to slightly larger failure. In 1587, he tried again. This time he appointed John White as governor. White was a gentler soul than Lane. He was an artist, fond of sketching plants and people, and not nearly as fond of summary executions. The plan was to establish a permanent, self-sustaining settlement, including women and children. This would be England's first true colony in the New World. The group that set out included about 115 people, men, women, and children. Among them was White's own daughter, Eleanor, who was heavily pregnant. She would later give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America. A small but symbolic milestone. It all seemed so hopeful at the start, and then naturally it all went wrong. The settlers had originally planned to establish themselves in the Chesapeake Bay area, a more hospitable site. But their pilot, a man named Simon Fernandez, apparently grew impatient and decided to dump them back at Roanoke instead. Because, of course, nothing says trustworthy navigator like a man who abandons you wherever it's convenient for him. Back on Roanoke, the colonists discovered that the few men left behind from the previous venture were gone, most likely killed by local tribes. Supplies were low, tensions high. And because fate has a dry sense of humor, John White was persuaded to sail back to England to request more supplies. He didn't want to leave, especially with his family there, but the colony insisted. White reluctantly agreed, promising to return quickly. It would be 3 years before he made it back. The delay wasn't entirely his fault. England was at war with Spain, and the Spanish Armada was bearing down on the English coast. Every ship was commandeered for national defense. White's pleas for a resupply voyage were ignored. The colony, meanwhile, was left to fend for itself in a wilderness with limited provisions, dubious neighbors, and mosquitoes the size of pigeons. Finally, in 1590, White managed to return. When he arrived at Roanoke, the settlement was deserted. Houses dismantled, fortifications gone, not a soul in sight. The only clue was that word carved into a wooden post, CROATOAN. White took it as a hopeful sign. The colonists had agreed that if they ever had to relocate, they would carve a message into a tree or post, and if things were dire, they'd add a Maltese cross. There was no cross, just the word. White believed they had moved to CROATOAN Island, home to friendly allies of the same name. Unfortunately, a storm blew up before he could investigate. The ship's crew, already nervous and short on supplies, insisted they return to England, and so White, father, grandfather, governor, sailed back across the Atlantic without ever knowing what had happened to his family or his colony. He never saw them again, and that's where the mystery begins. What happened to the colonists of Roanoke? Theories abound. Some suggest they were absorbed into local tribes, marrying and blending in over time. Others believe they may have attempted to move inland and perished. There are darker theories, too, involving starvation or conflict. Archaeological evidence hints that at least some survivors joined native communities, but no one knows for sure. What we do know is that Raleigh's dream of a permanent colony at Roanoke failed spectacularly. The English would have to wait until 1607, with Jamestown, to establish something that actually stuck. And even Jamestown was basically a disaster zone for its first several years. Apparently, founding colonies was harder than showing up with flags and entitlement. Still, Roanoke's failure made it immortal. Its disappearance was so thorough, so anticlimactic, that it became fascinating. There were no bodies, no dramatic battles, no plague pits. Just silence, which, in a way, is the most haunting legacy of all, and perhaps the colonists preferred it that way. After all, if you had to choose between starving in a mosquito swamp under an irritable governor or vanishing into history as an unsolved mystery, the latter sounds almost peaceful. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine that quiet island, the waves brushing against the shore, the trees pressing in, full of cicadas, a carved word on a lonely post. and the soft sense that sometimes history doesn't give us answers, only whispers that fade into the night. Let's drift over to the next. Royal fiasco. The Habsburg jaw. Hey everyone. Since we've left Roanoke behind, empty houses, carved words, silence on the shore, let's drift across the ocean and peek into Europe. A place where mystery took a different form. Not disappearance this time, but genetic stubbornness. We're going to spend a little time with the Habsburgs, a dynasty so vast that at one point their family motto was essentially, "Let others wage war. You, lucky Habsburg, marry." And marry they did, over and over, usually to each other. The result, of course, was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a medical condition so pronounced that it became the family brand. If you've ever looked at portraits of Habsburg rulers and thought, why does his face look like it's melting forward? That's the jaw. But let's start slowly. The Habsburgs rose to power in the late Middle Ages, building a sprawling empire through strategic marriages. At first, this was clever politics. Marry your children into powerful houses, link dynasties, and expand your influence without lifting a sword. A tidy arrangement. Unfortunately, the family eventually took the motto a little too literally. Rather than branching out, they folded. In cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, at one point great-nieces married great-uncles. It was less a family tree than a family pretzel, and while the political gains were undeniable, territories stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to parts of Italy, the genetic consequences were equally undeniable. Over generations, features began to repeat and exaggerate. Long chins, heavy lower lips, overbites so severe that some Habsburgs could not fully close their mouths. By the 1500s, the Habsburg jaw was well established. It appeared in Emperor Maximilian I, but really blossomed in his grandson, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles ruled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, much of Italy and territories in the New World. He had more land than he knew what to do with. Unfortunately, he also had a face that suggested the front half was trying to escape. Contemporaries noted his speech was unclear, his chewing awkward, and his saliva production generous. In portraits, artists tried to flatter him, but even the most loyal court painter could not conceal the protruding chin. One ambassador tactfully described him as not handsome, which in the diplomatic language of the 16th century was roughly equivalent to calling someone a mildly alarming turnip. Charles V eventually abdicated, worn out by ruling too much territory, and perhaps also by chewing too much bread. He retired to a monastery, spending his final years praying, watching clocks and digesting meals at a pace that must have been heroic. But the jaw did not retire. It marched on through the generations. Charles's son, Philip II of Spain, inherited both the empire and the chin. Philip was a serious man, cold, devout, obsessed with paperwork. His face reflected this intensity, though it was difficult to look imposing when one's lower lip insisted on jutting out rebelliously. Philip married 4 times, including to his own niece, which did nothing to diversify the gene pool. His son, Philip III, inherited the crown and an even more exaggerated jawline. Observers noted that Philip III looked like he was perpetually chewing, even when silent. Imagine being remembered by history as the man whose entire face resembled unfinished mastication. By the time of Philip IV, the situation was dire. Philip IV's portraits, painted by the master Velázquez, are almost cruelly honest. The chin juts, the lips sag, the expression is weary. Still, Philip did his dynastic duty, marrying his niece Mariana of Austria. She was 14, he was 44. It was considered appropriate, or at least convenient, because why let dignity get in the way of inbreeding? This union produced Charles II of Spain, poor Charles, known to history as the Bewitched. He was so inbred that his family tree looked like a circle. His jaw was enormous, his tongue too large for his mouth, his speech nearly incomprehensible. He drooled constantly, could barely chew food, and often swallowed it whole. Contemporaries described him as sickly, simple, and incapable of independent rule. He suffered from epilepsy, rickets, and countless other ailments. He could not walk properly until he was almost 8 years old. Tutors despaired of teaching him to read. At court ceremonies, he often sat in silence, staring vaguely ahead, while ministers argued over who actually controlled the kingdom. The tragedy of Charles II was not only physical, but political. Spain, under his reign, collapsed into near ruin. Bankrupt, militarily weak, and governed by squabbling factions, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. When he died in 1700, childless, his jaw and his dynasty finally gave up together. Modern geneticists have studied the Habsburgs extensively. One analysis found that Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of the offspring of a brother-sister marriage. Essentially, generations of dynastic convenience had produced a monarch with the genetic resilience of damp bread. And yet, in portraits, Charles II looks oddly serene. Vacant, yes, but calm. Perhaps in his own way, he was at peace. While everyone around him schemed and panicked about the succession, he simply existed, a quiet presence, a jawline that had reached its evolutionary endpoint. The story of the Habsburg jaw is both tragic and absurd. A dynasty so desperate to keep power in the family that they quite literally folded the family in on itself. It's a reminder that politics and genetics make uneasy bedfellows, and that sometimes the price of empire is paid not in gold or blood, but in bone structure. So as you rest tonight, picture those grand Spanish palaces, candlelight flickering on endless corridors, portraits of kings whose faces all blur into the same downward slope, and at the end of the line, Charles II, silent, sickly, a monarch who embodied an empire's decline in every crooked angle of his jaw. Let's drift gently forward to yet another royal life that went magnificently wrong. Charles II of Spain, the bewitched king. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're moving from the broad sweep of the Habsburg jaw into the quiet, fragile life of its most famous owner, a man who inherited not only an empire, but also centuries of inbreeding, fragile health, and the rather cruel nickname of the Bewitched. This is the story of Charles II of Spain, a king so sickly and unlucky that his very existence sometimes felt like a cosmic prank. Charles was born in Madrid in 1661. His father, Philip IV, was already old, exhausted, and frankly, ready to be done with the whole business of ruling. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his niece and his wife, because of course she was. That detail alone meant Charles entered the world with a family tree that looked suspiciously like a circle. From the start, things went badly. Charles did not cry at birth. He was weak, sickly, and misshapen. His jaw protruded so far that he struggled to close his mouth. His tongue was oversized, making speech and eating nearly impossible. He drooled constantly, which was awkward in a court that valued dignity above all things. Imagine trying to command respect while producing a steady trickle of saliva down your chin. He was slow to develop in every sense. Charles could not walk until he was almost 8 years old. He could not speak until 4. His tutors tried to educate him, but reading, writing, and even basic conversation were uphill battles. Court reports noted with the bluntness of frustrated bureaucrats that the young king was imbecile and of very weak constitution, which, to be fair, was accurate. And yet, Charles was king. His older brother had died in infancy. He was the last surviving son of Philip IV. There was no alternative. The fate of Spain rested on a child who could barely stand. As Charles grew, the situation didn't improve much. He was often ill, his legs were thin and weak, his body frail. His head, by contrast, was large and misshapen, with that famous Habsburg chin jutting forward like an architectural overhang. His teeth did not meet properly, which made chewing almost impossible. Some reports claim he often swallowed food whole, which probably explains the constant stomach problems that plagued him. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Many in Spain believed his condition must have been the result of sorcery. After all, how else could you explain a monarch so pitiably fragile, born into the most powerful dynasty in Europe? Clergy were summoned to perform exorcisms. Relics were pressed against him. At one point, friars insisted that witches had stolen parts of his body at night. None of it helped, naturally. Meanwhile, his mother Mariana effectively ruled as regent. She surrounded herself with advisors who squabbled for influence, while Charles sat in the background like a ghost of royalty. He was technically present, but never truly in control. By his teens, it became clear that the greatest dynastic question was not whether Charles could rule, but whether he could produce an heir. If Spain was to avoid chaos, Charles needed to marry and continue the line. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of King Louis XIV of France. She was young, vivacious, and, poor woman, married to Charles at the age of 17. Court. Gossip claimed she wept constantly at the prospect, which, considering the alternative, was reasonable. Life with Charles was bleak. He adored Marie-Louise, but his physical condition made intimacy nearly impossible. Contemporary accounts suggested he was impotent. He may have also been sterile, thanks to his inbred genetics. Court physicians and priests pestered the couple with remedies, strange diets, prayers, even magical cures. Nothing worked. Marie-Louise never conceived. Her life in Spain was miserable. The court was rigid, formal, and obsessed with appearances. She was expected to eat enormous meals to prove her fertility, despite being naturally slim and often sick to her stomach. She became depressed, fell ill frequently, and died young at just 26, officially of appendicitis, but whispered to have been poisoned. Though realistically, the stress of being married to Charles II could have killed anyone. After her death, Charles remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen largely because her family was famously fertile. One of her sisters had produced 23 children. The Spanish court hoped some of that productivity would rub off. Spoiler, it did not. Maria Anna was clever and politically ambitious, but she quickly discovered that her new husband was incapable of fathering children. Their marriage remained childless, and the Spanish dynasty's fate grew darker by the year. Charles's health collapsed in his later years. He suffered seizures, infections, constant fevers. His body was riddled with ailments, swollen legs, skin disorders, digestive problems. By his 30s, he was bald, toothless, and nearly blind. His appearance was ghastly, even by the forgiving standards of 17th century royalty. In 1699, desperate to explain his condition, the court ordered an autopsy while Charles was still alive. Not literally, but close enough. Doctors examined him, drew endless amounts of blood, and subjected him to bizarre treatments. When he finally died in 1700, aged only 38, an actual autopsy was performed. The doctor's report was grimly theatrical. They declared that his body did not contain a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and that his head was full of water. Most modern historians suspect exaggeration. Spanish doctors were not known for understatement, but even discounting the drama, it's clear Charles was catastrophically unhealthy, and with him died the Spanish Habsburg line. No children, no heir. Just centuries of empire collapsing into a single fragile body and then into nothing. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that lasted more than a decade. In a way, Charles's jawline caused more trouble after his death than he ever did while alive. What makes Charles II so haunting is the contrast. Here was a man born to unimaginable power, King of Spain, lord of vast territories across Europe and the Americas, and yet he was, by all accounts, gentle, weak, and incapable of wielding that power. His life was a living illustration of dynastic decline, of what happens when political ambition ignores biology. And yet, if we step back from the grim details, there's something almost tender about him. In portraits, he looks pale and melancholy, but not unkind. He loved his first wife, he prayed earnestly, he endured endless treatments and humiliations without rebellion. He never asked for the crown that crushed him. He simply bore it in silence until his body gave out. So as you rest tonight, picture the royal palace in Madrid, the vast echoing halls, the heavy curtains drawn against the sun, a frail king sitting quietly, his chin jutting, his lips slack, his eyes vague, surrounded by scheming courtiers, by ambitious priests, by nervous doctors, but in the middle of it all just a fragile man, sad, sickly, and strangely peaceful. The empire crumbled around him, the dynasty ended with him, but for a moment he sat there breathing softly, a reminder that even the most powerful thrones can end in silence. And now, let's drift onward, to another royal disaster, born not of frailty, but of too much appetite. Henry VIII, a king who ate his way through wives and kingdoms, everyone. Tonight we're floating across the Channel, from the pale, fragile halls of Madrid to the more boisterous and frankly more dangerous courts of Tudor England. Our subject this time is Henry VIII, a man who, unlike Charles II of Spain, was not weak, sickly, or delicate. Quite the opposite. Henry was big, loud, spoiled, and convinced the world existed largely to satisfy his whims. If Charles was too frail to do much of anything, Henry was too determined not to stop. Where Charles could barely chew bread, Henry devoured everything, food, power, and wives, with equal enthusiasm. Henry was born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII. His older brother Arthur was expected to rule, but Arthur died young, leaving Henry unexpectedly next in line. That little accident of fate changed everything. Henry wasn't raised to be king, he was raised to be a charming spare, which might explain why, once he got the throne, he treated it more like a personal playground than a national responsibility. He came to power in 1509, young, handsome, athletic. Chroniclers swooned over his broad shoulders, his golden hair, and his skill in jousting. He was said to be the very model of a Renaissance prince, which is a polite way of saying he was pretty, energetic, and loved showing off. Henry's early reign looked promising. He was intelligent, well-educated, and genuinely interested in culture. He played music, wrote poetry, and surrounded himself with scholars. If he had stayed that way, perhaps we'd remember him as a mild, golden Renaissance monarch. But unfortunately, Henry discovered two things: absolute power and his own appetite. Neither sat lightly. Henry's reign, of course, is remembered, mainly for his 6 wives. 6 is a lot, even by royal standards. Most kings were content with a discreet mistress or 2. Henry, however, managed to treat marriage itself as a kind of revolving door. Each union was supposed to solve his dynastic problems, and each one made those problems worse. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon. She had been married briefly to Henry's older brother Arthur, but Arthur died, leaving her a widow at 16. Henry, still a teenager himself, married her in what seemed like a safe dynastic choice. Catherine was pious, dignified, and genuinely fond of Henry. For many years they appeared happy, But Catherine had one great misfortune. She bore Henry no surviving sons. She gave birth several times, but the children either died young or were stillborn. Only one daughter, Mary, survived. In an age when dynasties rose or fell on male heirs, this was catastrophic. Henry grew increasingly restless. He adored Catherine, but he adored the idea of a son more. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne was clever, stylish, and refused to play the role of mistress. She wanted to be queen or nothing. Henry became obsessed. He pursued her for years, convinced that she would bear him the son Catherine could not. The problem, of course, was that he was still married, and so Henry embarked on what can only be described as the most chaotic divorce in history. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry simply declared that England no longer recognized papal authority. Thus began the English Reformation, not because of theology, not because of principle, but because Henry really wanted to remarry. Henry married Anne in 1533. Catherine was cast aside. Anne gave birth the same year, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but still hopeful. Surely more children would follow. They didn't. Anne had miscarriages. Henry grew sour. Court gossip whispered that Anne was sharp-tongued, ambitious, and difficult, which, to be fair, she probably was, but so was Henry. Unfortunately, only one of them had the power to declare people traitors. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery and treason. The evidence was flimsy at best, ludicrous at worst. One accusation claimed she had seduced her own brother. Nevertheless, she was found guilty. Henry had her executed at the Tower of London. He then rode out hunting the next morning as though nothing had happened. Anne's downfall cleared the way for wife number 3, Jane Seymour. Jane was quiet, obedient, and everything Anne had not been. She gave Henry what he craved most, a son, Edward. Sadly, Jane died soon after childbirth. Henry mourned her more sincerely than he had mourned anyone else, perhaps because she finally gave him what he wanted, or perhaps because, unlike his other wives, she didn't live long enough to disappoint him. After Jane, the pattern became almost farcical. Henry agreed to marry Anne of Cleves, a German princess, but when he met her in person, he declared her unattractive and claimed he had been tricked by flattering portraits. The marriage was annulled in less than 6 months. Anne of Cleves wisely accepted a generous settlement and retired peacefully. She is the only wife who escaped Henry with her head, her fortune, and her dignity intact. Next came Catherine Howard, a teenager more than 20 years younger than Henry. By this time, Henry was in his late 40s, obese, and suffering from a festering leg wound that smelled so badly courtiers gagged in his presence. Catherine, lively and flirtatious, was not exactly devoted. When rumors of her affairs reached Henry, he was enraged. She was executed in 1542, only a teenager at her death. Finally, there was Catherine Parr. Sensible, intelligent, twice widowed, she managed to outlive Henry. She spent most of her time nursing him through his declining health and maneuvering delicately around his moods. When Henry died in 1547, Catherine Parr was still alive, though no doubt aged a decade by the experience. 6 wives, 2 executed, 2 divorced, 1 dead in childbirth. Only one outlived him, a pattern so grim that schoolchildren still memorize it with a morbid rhyme. But Henry's wives were only part of the story. His reign also left England transformed. The break with Rome reshaped religion. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth confiscated. Nobles enriched themselves, peasants were displaced, and the social fabric frayed. Henry himself grew grotesquely obese, his once athletic frame collapsing under indulgence. By the end, he weighed over 300 pounds, needed mechanical devices to hoist him onto horseback, and relied on servants to move his vast body around. The once handsome prince was gone, replaced by a bloated, paranoid monarch lashing out at friends. And foes alike. He had once been called golden. By the end he was more gravy-stained, and yet Henry remains one of the most famous kings in English history. Not because he was wise or benevolent, but because he was spectacularly dramatic. His reign was a collision of appetite, ego, and dynastic anxiety. He was both comic and tragic, an overgrown child playing with crowns and lives. So as you drift, tonight, picture Henry in his final years, seated heavily on a gilded throne, the smell of his leg wound wafting through the air, servants struggling to lift him upright. He scowls, jowls quivering, as another petition is placed before him. Somewhere in the palace, portraits of his wives watch silently, a reminder of love lost, squandered, or executed. Henry VIII, a king who consumed everything around him, until nothing was left but the echoes of his appetite. And now, let's drift forward to a very different royal fate, one defined not by excess, but by melancholy. The children of Henry VIII, a dynasty of fragile crowns, welcome back. Tonight, as you settle under your blankets, let's drift into the candlelit halls of Tudor England once more. We've already met Henry VIII, the man who managed to turn marriage into a national sport. But what about the children left behind by his 6 wives? Henry's obsession with producing a son left England with not one, but 3 very different heirs. Each ruled in turn, and each proved that perhaps the Tudors were not so much a dynasty of glory as one of fragility, paranoia, and slow-burning tragedy. Let's begin with Edward VI. Edward was Henry's only legitimate son, born to Jane Seymour in 1537. Henry adored him, of course, finally the long-awaited boy. But Henry died when Edward was only 9 years old. That meant the crown fell onto a child who could barely manage his lessons, let alone an entire kingdom. Edward was bright, scholarly, and devoutly Protestant. But he was also frail, thin, pale, often sick. He ruled for just 6 years, though in truth he didn't rule at all. Regents and ministers squabbled for control while Edward coughed and wasted away. The boy king loved books, theology, and the idea of reform. He banned images in churches, ordered new prayer books, and nudged England more firmly toward Protestantism. But physically, he was declining. By his mid-teens, Edward was visibly dying, likely of tuberculosis. On his deathbed in 1553, desperate to keep Protestantism alive, Edward altered the line of succession. He bypassed both of his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and instead named Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane was his cousin, a quiet teenage girl more interested in reading Plato than ruling England. Edward died at just 15. His reign, brief and bloodless, is remembered mostly for its wasted potential. England's only true Tudor son faded away before he could ever grow into his crown. Which brings us to Mary Why. Mary was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had grown up adored by her mother, only to watch her cast aside. When Henry divorced Catherine, Mary was declared illegitimate, stripped of her titles, and forced to live apart. She adored her mother, despised her father, and developed a burning devotion to Catholicism. When Edward tried to write her out of the succession, Mary refused to accept it. The country rallied to her side. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. For just 9 days before Mary's supporters marched on London, Jane was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually executed. Mary was triumphant. Mary restored Catholicism with fervor. But her reign quickly turned bitter. She married Philip II of Spain, an alliance meant to strengthen her position. The marriage, however, was deeply unpopular. Philip spent most of his time abroad, leaving Mary lonely and humiliated. Mary suffered 2 phantom pregnancies, her belly swelling, her hopes rising, only for nothing to come of them. Each disappointment cut her deeply. In the meantime, she earned her dark nickname, Bloody Mary. by burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. To Mary, this was justice. To her people, it was terror. She died childless in 1558, at the age of 42. Alone, ill, and convinced she had failed, she left behind a realm divided and smouldering. And then came Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child for whom Henry broke with Rome. After her mother's execution, Elizabeth grew up clever, cautious, and constantly aware of how precarious her life was. Declared illegitimate one day, reinstated another, her status shifted with the political winds. When Mary died, Elizabeth became queen at 25. Unlike her brother and sister, Elizabeth lasted. She reigned for 45 years, one of the longest and most celebrated monarchs in English history. But make no mistake, Elizabeth's reign was not golden because it was easy. It was golden because she survived. She inherited a fractured kingdom, Protestant versus Catholic, noble versus noble, enemies circling abroad. She played them all with careful theatre. She dressed herself as the Virgin Queen, married to her country, while dangling suitors for diplomatic advantage. She spoke like a poet, but ruled like a chess master. Elizabeth's court glittered with drama. Shakespeare wrote, Raleigh explored, Essex rebelled. And yet, for all the splendor, Elizabeth remained fundamentally alone. She never married, never bore children, never trusted anyone completely. In portraits, she is painted with white makeup, pearls, and symbols of eternal youth. But beneath the powdered mask, she aged, grew frail, and lost her teeth. She died in 1603, childless. With her, the Tudor line ended. So there you have it. Henry's desperate quest for heirs gave England three very different monarchs. Edward, the fragile boy who died before his voice even deepened. Mary, the bitter queen who burned her enemies but never bore a child. Elizabeth, the survivor who ruled gloriously but left no legacy of blood. Together they are less a triumphant dynasty than a cautionary tale. A family consumed by Henry's appetites, undone by their own frailty, and finally extinguished in a puff of powder and smoke. And so, as you drift tonight, imagine the Tudor line flickering out like the last candle in a cold chamber. Edward's pale hand clutching a Bible, Mary whispering prayers in Spanish to a God who never gave her a child. Elizabeth, painted forever young, sitting alone in her great hall, knowing that death was finally at the door. The Tudors, brilliant, tragic, and gone. And next, we'll leave England's candlelit halls for another dynasty doomed not by appetite or frailty, but by sheer historical accident. The last of the Romanovs. The fall of the Romanovs, a dynasty snuffed out. Hey everyone, tonight let's step softly out of Tudor England's creaky halls and into the chill silence of a Russian winter, a place where palaces gleamed with chandeliers, but also where entire dynasties could end in a basement with a single order. The Romanovs were Russia's ruling family for over 300 years. They were crowned in cathedrals, lived in gilded palaces, and pretended to be something close to divine. But by the early 20th century, they were clinging to their power with all the grace of a man dangling from a frozen clothesline. And eventually, history decided to let go. Our focus tonight drifts to the final Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family. The very last sparks of a dynasty extinguished in 1918. Nicholas was crowned in 1894 at the tender age of 26. He was earnest, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. Unfortunately, he was also indecisive, out of touch, and allergic to political reform. He once described himself as utterly unfit to reign, and tragically he was correct. But Nicholas had something else. He had love. He married Alexandra Feodorovna, a German princess who adored him completely. They were a devoted pair, which is sweet in theory, except Alexandra had opinions, and Nicholas tended to follow them. Her advice was often terrible, her sense of politics worse. But their marriage was at least consistent, two people equally ill-suited for ruling the world's largest empire. The couple had 4 daughters in quick succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. All lovely, all bright, but all very much not what Russia wanted. The empire was desperate for a son, a male heir to inherit the throne. The pressure weighed heavily on Alexandra, who finally delivered a boy in 1904, Alexei. And here's where things unraveled further. Alexei was the long-awaited heir, but he had hemophilia, a genetic disorder that meant his blood would not clot properly. Even a minor injury could prove fatal. This wasn't just tragic, it was politically disastrous. The Romanovs had spent centuries projecting strength. Now their future hinged on a fragile boy who could be undone by a stumble or bruise. Nicholas and Alexandra tried to keep his illness secret, but court rumors spread like frost across a window pane. The empire whispered, "The dynasty is weak." Desperate for a cure, Alexandra turned to mystics, holy men, anyone who promised salvation. And that's how Rasputin entered the story. Grigory Rasputin, a wandering peasant mystic from Siberia, unkempt, strange, radiating a kind of unsettling charisma. To some, he was a holy man. To others, he was an opportunistic fraud. To Alexandra, he was a lifeline. When Alexei bled, Rasputin seemed able to calm him, perhaps by reducing stress, or perhaps by forbidding the use of harmful treatments. Whatever the reason, Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was divinely sent. She shielded him from critics, even as rumors swirled that the mad monk had far too much influence in government and perhaps in the royal bedchamber as well. Rasputin became the grotesque symbol of the Romanov decline. While Nicholas mishandled wars and reforms, Rasputin slithered through palace corridors, whispering advice, drinking heavily, and apparently being very difficult to poison. We'll come back to that part. Meanwhile, the empire itself was crumbling. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, a humiliation since they had expected to crush a minor Asian power. Instead, Japan sank their fleet and exposed Russia's military incompetence. Back home, protesters filled the streets demanding reform. On Bloody Sunday, peaceful demonstrators marching in St. Petersburg were fired upon by soldiers. Hundreds died. The Romanovs' aura of sacred protection shattered. Nicholas was forced to grant a parliament, the Duma, but he undercut its power almost immediately. It was reform in name only. Russia simmered with discontent. Then came World War I. Nicholas led his country into battle in 1914, confident that patriotism would unite the people. Instead, millions of Russian soldiers died in mud and misery. Supplies ran out, cities starved. While Nicholas took personal command at the front, Alexandra was left in charge at home, guided by Rasputin's ramblings. The optics were not ideal. By 1917, Russia had had enough. Strikes paralyzed St. Petersburg. Soldiers mutinied. The empire dissolved almost overnight. Nicholas abdicated in March. 3 centuries of Romanov rule collapsed with a single shaky signature. The family was placed under house arrest, first in palaces, then in increasingly smaller, gloomier quarters. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, reading, sewing, tending gardens. But their world had shrunk to a handful of guarded rooms, and here's where the story darkens into its final, hushed act. In July 1918, the family was moved to a house in Yekaterinburg. Local Bolsheviks feared they might be rescued by advancing White Army forces. So, in the early hours of July 17th, the Romanovs were awakened and told they were being relocated. Instead, they were led to a basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and the sickly Alexei stood together. Nicholas, ever polite, asked for chairs for his wife and son. Then, on a signal, armed men opened fire. The Romanovs died in a brutal, confused hail of bullets, bayonets, and smoke, the basement filled with chaos, ricochets, and muffled screams. It was not noble. It was not clean. It was not the end a dynasty would have chosen for itself, but it was the end. The bodies were hidden, burned, buried. For decades, rumors persisted that one or more of the children, Anastasia most famously, had survived. Imposters surfaced across Europe, claiming to be her. DNA testing in the late 20th century confirmed what had long been suspected. None escaped. The Romanovs had been extinguished in that basement. And Rasputin, he had already been dispatched 2 years earlier in suitably over-the-top fashion, poisoned, shot, clubbed, and finally drowned. It took all of that to finally silence him, because of course it did. So what are we left with? The Romanovs' fall is often told as tragedy. And yes, there's tragedy here. The children especially, caught in the gears of history, guilty of nothing beyond their last name. But it is also irony. An empire that ruled by divine right, undone by its own fragility, its stubborn refusal to adapt, and its embrace of mystics over ministers. Nicholas and Alexandra loved each other deeply, but their love blinded them. They adored their son, but his illness chained them to superstition. They clung to their crowns, but their hands were weak, and history pried them away. As you drift into sleep tonight, picture the last Romanovs not as the grand figures of legend, but as a family sitting together in a dimly lit room, children whispering, parents praying, a sickly boy in his mother's arms. A dynasty reduced at last to the simple and very human fear of what tomorrow would bring. And when the basement doors closed, so too did the story of the Romanovs. But don't worry, we'll open another candlelit hallway next time. Perhaps one filled with Spanish Habsburgs who married cousins until their family tree resembled a tangled knot of wilted branches. The Habsburgs, a family tree that folded in on itself. Good evening. Tonight's story is one of dynasties again, but this time not one that collapsed in a basement. No, this family collapsed slowly, over centuries, through choices that might best be described as genealogically questionable. Let's talk about the Habsburgs of Spain. Yes, the ones with the famously unfortunate jawline. The Habsburgs were one of Europe's great dynasties. For centuries they ruled vast territories, Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. Their motto was, "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, a lot, often, to each other. Why? Well, marriage was their weapon of choice. Instead of conquering by sword, they conquered by betrothal. Lands, titles, alliances, all secured by handing off daughters and nephews into carefully arranged unions. The problem, of course, is that after a few generations of marrying cousins to keep the empire intact, the family tree started looking more like a tightly knotted bush, and nowhere was this more extreme than in Spain. Let's begin with Philip II, the so-called most Catholic king, who reigned in the 16th century. He was powerful, wealthy, and relentlessly pious. He also married 4 times. His first wife was a Portuguese princess, his second wife, his cousin, his third wife, also his cousin, his fourth wife, his niece. Yes, his niece. Philip was many things, but squeamish about family boundaries was not one of them. The dynasty carried on like this for generations, drawing closer and closer to itself. By the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs were the living embodiment of a genetic bottleneck, which brings us to their most infamous specimen, Charles II of Spain. Charles was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, which sounds ordinary enough, until you realize Mariana was both Philip's niece and his wife. which means Charles's family tree wasn't just tangled, it was looping back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. The results were not great. Charles was sickly from birth. His lower jaw jutted so far forward he could barely chew. His tongue was oversized, making speech difficult. He didn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was almost 5. And he never learned to read properly. But Charles wasn't just physically weak. He was plagued with seizures, frequent illness and infertility. Court doctors noted his body seemed one person's from the waist up, another's from the waist down, which is a very polite 17th century way of saying this child had been through too many rounds of cousin marriage to function properly. The poor man became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because people genuinely believed he had been cursed by sorcery. In truth, he was cursed by generations of short-sighted dynastic strategy, and yet Charles II was king. King of one of the wealthiest empires in the world, ruling over territories that stretched from Spain to the Americas. Imagine that. The Spanish Empire, gold pouring in from Mexico and Peru, its fleets crossing the Atlantic, all in the hands of a monarch who could barely chew his food. Court politics became surreal. Since Charles had no children, every faction in Europe started planning for his eventual death. His body, his marriage bed, his fertility, these weren't private matters. They were international crises. He married twice. First to a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans. Their union produced no heirs, though whether that was due to Charles's condition or other issues is still debated. After her death, he married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. That too produced no heirs. As the years dragged on, Charles grew increasingly paranoid. He blamed witchcraft for his health. He underwent bizarre exorcisms, sometimes involving priests shouting prayers directly into his mouth to cast out the demon. Unsurprisingly, this did not improve his condition. By the late 1690s, Charles was a shell of a man. He was bald, toothless, drooling, and barely able to walk. Yet courtiers still debated who would inherit his empire the moment he died. The answer would decide the future of Europe. Charles finally died in 1700 at the age of 38. The autopsy report was grim. His body contained no blood, only water. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His intestines were rotten, his lungs corroded, and his testicles described as black and withered. This was the end result of 2 centuries of inbreeding. The once mighty Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty collapsed into biological ruin. With Charles's death, the Spanish throne passed to the Bourbon dynasty of France, sparking the War of the Spanish Succession. And so ended the Spanish Habsburg line, not with a bang but with a wheeze, a curse, and an autopsy report that reads like a horror story. Now, before we all drift into dark dreams, let's step back for a moment. It's easy to mock Charles II. He has become the cartoon symbol of aristocratic inbreeding. But there's something sad here too. Charles himself had no choice in his lineage. He was born into a system that valued dynastic purity over human health. He lived a short, painful life, burdened with responsibilities he could never fulfill, surrounded by people who treated him as both sacred monarch and tragic mistake. The irony is sharp. The Habsburgs spent centuries marrying cousins to keep their empire intact, but in the end, it destroyed them. The dynasty collapsed from within, not because of outside enemies, but because they closed their marriage doors too tightly. So tonight, as the candles flicker low, picture the last Habsburg king of Spain, a fragile man in silks and jewels, sitting in a vast palace that smelled faintly of mildew and incense. A man whose jawline told the whole story of a dynasty that folded in on itself until nothing was left. And when his eyes closed for the last time in 1700, Europe itself shifted and the world moved on. Napoleon, the emperor who couldn't sit still, Hey everyone, tonight let's float away from the doomed Spanish Habsburgs and into a different kind of royal fiasco. This one isn't about inbreeding or fragile bloodlines. No, this one is about energy. Endless, restless energy. Because our subject tonight was not born into a long and tangled dynasty. He was not weighed down by centuries of cousin marriage. He was instead a Corsican artillery officer who decided quite confidently that he should be Emperor of France. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon is one of those figures who fills entire libraries. Generals still study his campaigns. Historians still argue about his motives. But tonight, we aren't trying to win any battles. We're just here to drift through the strange life of a man who went from an obscure island childhood to crowning himself emperor in front of the Pope, because of course he did. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which had only just been acquired by France. His family was minor nobility, important enough to send him to French military school, but not important enough to impress his classmates. In fact, young Napoleon was mocked relentlessly for his accent, his shabby clothes, and his short stature, which, of course, he never forgot. Napoleon would spend much of his adult life trying to prove every insult wrong. He rose quickly during the French Revolution. When most aristocrats were losing their heads, Napoleon was busy climbing the ranks. He was ambitious, clever, and, most importantly, available. In a time when France desperately needed officers who weren't dead or exiled, he was ready to step in. By his mid-20s, Napoleon was already famous. His victories in Italy turned him into a national hero. His expedition to Egypt, less successful. He didn't conquer much, but he did return with crates of artifacts and a team of scholars who accidentally kick-started modern Egyptology. Not a total failure then, and in 1799 he staged a coup. France had been stumbling through revolutionary chaos for a decade, and Napoleon decided he was the man to tidy things up. He seized power, declared himself first consul, and a few years later, naturally, crowned himself emperor. Yes, the Pope was there, holding the crown, ready to perform the ceremony. But Napoleon took it out of his hands and plopped it onto his own head. Because why let someone else have the satisfaction? So, here was Napoleon, short, restless, crowned, and finally in charge of France. His empire expanded quickly. He crushed Austria. He humbled Prussia. He rearranged German states, like a man redecorating his living room. He even sold Louisiana to the United States, because Europe, frankly, was more interesting than swamps full of mosquitoes. But Napoleon's greatest victories always came with a touch of irony. At Austerlitz, he defeated a larger army by luring them onto a frozen lake. Very clever. The lake cracked, men drowned, and Napoleon gained eternal glory. And yet, despite his genius, he had a habit of making things worse for himself. He imposed harsh laws, censored newspapers, and filled Europe with resentful vassals. And then, of course, there was his marriage. Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais, a glamorous widow with excellent social connections. He adored her. He wrote her letters so passionate they teetered on embarrassing. Josephine, however, was less enthusiastic. She had affairs. She was infertile. Eventually, Napoleon reluctantly divorced her. He needed an heir. So naturally he married Marie-Louise of Austria. Yes, the Habsburgs again, the very family that had produced poor Charles II. But Marie-Louise was young, healthy, and importantly, able to bear children. She gave Napoleon a son, Napoleon II, whom the emperor promptly nicknamed the King of Rome. Modest, as always, but even with a son, Napoleon couldn't stop moving. He launched the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. He marched in with over 600,000 men. He returned with, well, not many. Winter, starvation, disease, and Cossack raids destroyed his army. The retreat from Moscow became the stuff of legend: frozen soldiers, starving horses, cannons abandoned in the snow. Still, Napoleon wasn't done. He rebuilt his forces, he fought on, but by 1814, Europe had had enough. Coalition armies invaded France. Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated. He was sent to exile on the island of Elba, which sounds like punishment, but in truth, it was almost comfortable. He had a villa, servants, a little army, and even supervised road repairs. But Napoleon wasn't built for island retirement. After less than a year, he escaped. He sailed back to France. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead, and in what might be the most dramatic comeback in history, he marched into Paris, reclaimed the throne, and declared himself emperor once again. This period is known as the 100 Days, and, predictably, it ended with the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army. The battle was long, muddy, and bloody, and at the end of it Napoleon's dreams collapsed. For good this time. He was exiled again, this time to the island of St. Helena, far out, in the Atlantic. No comfortable villa, no road projects, just isolation, dampness, and endless complaints about his furniture. He spent his final years dictating memoirs, quarreling with his British jailers, and insisting he was still destined for greatness. He died in 1821 at the age of 51. Officially, it was stomach cancer. Some believe he was poisoned by arsenic in the wallpaper dye. Either way, the restless emperor finally stopped moving, and here lies the irony. Napoleon spent his life chasing power, territory, and eternal glory. He wanted to be remembered as a new Caesar, a conqueror of empires. And he is remembered, just not quite as he wished. Today, most people think of him as the short man with the big hat who lost at Waterloo, which in its own quiet way is the perfect bedtime ending. So as you drift off tonight, picture him there, a small man in a large chair staring across the ocean from a lonely island, still convinced the world should be his, while history quietly moved on without him. Napoleon II, the boy emperor, who never ruled. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're floating gently into one of history's sadder dynastic footnotes, a life that was supposed to be dazzling, world-changing and full of triumph, but instead turned out short, sheltered and painfully anticlimactic. We're talking about Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte, known rather ambitiously as the King of Rome. Later remembered with even more tragic grandeur as Napoleon II, yes, an emperor, who never actually ruled, which admittedly is the safest kind of emperor to be. Napoleon II was born in 1811, the only legitimate son of Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria. The French court was deliriously excited. The Bonaparte dynasty had seemed shaky up. To that point, Napoleon had no children from Josephine, and the empire needed an heir. When the boy was born, Paris erupted with joy. Cannons fired, bells rang. He was hailed as the continuation of Napoleon's great imperial project. The title he received, King of Rome, was meant to echo ancient glory. It was, of course, rather presumptuous. Rome hadn't been in French hands for very long, and the Austrians, his mother's family, probably rolled their eyes. But Napoleon adored the child. He was convinced his son would one day rule Europe, carrying the Bonaparte name into eternity. Naturally, history had other plans. Only 3 years later, Napoleon's empire collapsed. He was forced to abdicate in 1814. In theory, he abdicated in favor of his son, naming him Napoleon II. But in practice, France had had enough Bonapartes for the moment. The boy was only 3 years old, which didn't help. So instead of crowning him, the Allies restored the Bourbons, and Louis XVI waddled back onto the throne. For the tiny would-be emperor, it meant exile. His mother, Marie-Louise, quietly returned to her Austrian family, taking her son with her. And in Vienna, the child was stripped of his French title. He was no longer Napoleon II, King of Rome. Instead, he was granted a rather more provincial identity, the Duke of Reichstadt, which, let's be honest, sounds more like a minor bureaucrat's post than the heir of a conqueror. And so the boy who was supposed to inherit France grew up in an Austrian palace, surrounded by Habsburg relatives who mostly regarded him as a curiosity. He was raised carefully, under the supervision of his grandfather, Emperor Francis I, and carefully in this case meant stiflingly. The Austrians did not want another Napoleon rising in their midst. They dressed him in uniforms, drilled him in military etiquette, but kept him far from actual politics. He was praised for his intelligence, his manners, his polite reserve. He studied languages, history, and fencing. And he grew up hearing endlessly about his father, yet never allowed to see him. Napoleon himself, of course, was stuck on St. Helena, writing memoirs and dreaming of a dynasty that no longer existed. His son was thousands of miles away, being molded into an obedient Habsburg prince. There was always tension around his identity. French Bonapartists wanted him back. They whispered that one day the young Napoleon would reclaim the throne, avenge his father, and restore the empire. Monarchists in Austria, meanwhile, saw him as dangerous, an unstable spark that could ignite rebellion, so he was kept under close watch. He wasn't exactly imprisoned, but he wasn't free either. He was a political symbol, a human trophy, and nothing more. The boy himself seems to have absorbed the pressure. He was described as melancholy, serious, and lonely. Courtiers noted that he spoke often of his father, even though he barely remembered him. He once said wistfully, "I wish I could resemble him," which is rather heartbreaking, considering he was deliberately prevented from doing so. Physically, he inherited some of Napoleon's features, a broad forehead, piercing eyes, a stocky build. But he lacked the restless energy. He had ill health. From an early age, pale skin, frequent coughs, shortness of breath. He struggled to keep up in military drills. Still, he tried. He wore uniforms constantly, posed for portraits with swords, and signed letters as if he were destined for command. He once told a tutor, "I do not wish to be an Austrian prince. I want to be a French soldier." Which, of course, was exactly what his Habsburg family feared most. By the late 1820s, his health deteriorated further. Tuberculosis had set in. Doctors, as was traditional, recommended fresh air, gentle exercise, and not too much excitement, which is easy advice to give when the patient has no life to be excited about. He declined quickly. In 1832, at the age of only 21, he died in Vienna. Quietly. Without ever ruling, without ever leaving Austria, without ever seeing France again. The young man who had once been celebrated as Napoleon II, an emperor before he could walk, was gone. His body was buried in Vienna, among his Habsburg relatives rather than in France. It was, in its own way, a final insult. The empire his father had fought so hard to build had reduced his son to a pale shadow, and yet in death the legend lingered. Bonapartists continued to dream. They romanticized him as the eaglet, the offspring of the great eagle, Napoleon, a symbol of lost glory, cut down too soon. Later, in the 1940s, Adolf Hitler actually arranged for his remains to be moved to Paris, reinterred at Les Invalides near his father, which was a propaganda stunt, but also proof that even more than a century later, the name Napoleon carried weight. Today, Napoleon II is remembered mostly as a tragic figure. A boy emperor who never ruled. A young man trapped between two worlds. Adored by Bonapartists, smothered by Habsburgs, and ultimately claimed by illness. And it's ironic, isn't it? His father had too much energy, too much ambition. Napoleon I couldn't stop moving, scheming, conquering, and his son had none of that. He lived quietly, dutifully, and died before he had the chance to make any terrible mistakes. In a way, He was the perfect monarch because he never reigned, which may not be what his father envisioned, but is perhaps the gentlest legacy he could have left behind. So as you drift tonight, picture him, a pale young man in an oversized military uniform standing in an Austrian garden, coughing softly, dreaming of a France he would never see. History promised him an empire and delivered him a quiet tomb instead. George III, the Mad King of England, hello again, my friend. Let's drift across the Channel into Britain. Tonight's story is about a man whose reign was long, consequential, and frequently miserable. A king who lost America, argued with his ministers, squabbled with his sons, and eventually lost his grip on his own mind. George III, often remembered simply as the Mad King. He was born in 1738 in London. Unlike many Hanoverian royals before him, George was actually born in Britain, spoke English as his first language, and genuinely thought of himself as British. This was a novelty. His father and grandfather had been more German than anything else, so George's early life gave him a useful public image, a king who might, for once, fit neatly on the island throne. He became king in 1760, at the age of just 22. Britain at that moment was wealthy, ambitious, and embroiled in a global struggle with France. George inherited an empire that stretched across oceans, and he was determined to be a moral, diligent monarch. His motto was, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." He wanted to be a father figure to the nation, which sounds nice. But the trouble with father figures is, children don't always obey. Early in his reign, Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, seizing colonies from France and Spain. But the war had been expensive, and Parliament, prodded by George, looked across the Atlantic and decided the American colonists ought to pay their fair share. Taxes, duties, tea acts, the works. The colonists, of course, disagreed. They tossed tea into harbors, scribbled angry pamphlets, and eventually declared independence. George was furious. He considered the rebellion a personal insult. In his mind, he was the benevolent patriarch, keeping order in the family. And suddenly the children were screaming, slamming doors, and refusing to eat dinner. His reaction was stubborn. He urged Parliament to crush the rebellion. "The die is now cast," he declared. "The colonies must either submit or triumph." And triumph, unfortunately, they did. By 1783, Britain had recognized American independence. For George, it was humiliating. He's remembered in the United States, unfairly but permanently, as a sort of cartoon villain, the tyrant of the Declaration of Independence. Yet back in Britain, he recovered surprisingly well. The empire still had India, the Caribbean, and global trade routes. He turned his focus inward, working with Parliament, sponsoring agricultural reforms, and developing a reputation as a conscientious, if sometimes fussy, monarch. His personal life was, for a time, steady. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and unlike many royal marriages, theirs was affectionate and faithful. They had 15 children together. Yes, 15. Which sounds less like a royal family and more like a small boarding school. But then, of course, came the madness. George's mental health troubles are still debated. Some historians point to bipolar disorder. Others suggest a rare metabolic condition called porphyria, which can cause hallucinations, abdominal pain, and fits of delirium. Whatever the cause, his episodes were frightening. In 1788, the first major breakdown occurred. George began talking incessantly for hours without pause. He babbled, shouted, and sang. He foamed at the mouth. He grew violent at times, incoherent at others. His doctors, lacking much medical knowledge, treated him with restraints, blistering, and dubious herbal concoctions. At one point, he was tied to a chair for hours. News of the king's madness sent Parliament into crisis. A regency bill was prepared to hand power to his son, the Prince of Wales, who was lazy, extravagant, and deeply unpopular. But before it could be enacted, George recovered. By 1789 he was lucid again, attending Parliament, and even taking part in celebrations, marking his miraculous recovery. Unfortunately, the episodes kept returning. Each time, they left him more fragile. By the early 19th century, the king's mental decline was undeniable. He suffered bouts of blindness, deafness, and confusion. He raved about imaginary conversations. At Windsor, he was often seen talking to trees, believing they were messengers from beyond. His court tried to maintain dignity. Portraits still showed him as a stately, elderly monarch, but in reality he was being managed, restrained, and quietly kept out of sight. Politically, the country adapted. His son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, took over as Prince Regent in 1811. For nearly a decade, Britain had two kings, one real, but lost in madness, and one official, but largely ornamental. The Napoleonic Wars raged, Wellington fought. In Spain, Waterloo was won, and George III remained shut away, raving and broken. He lingered like this for years, blind, deaf, delusional. His beloved wife Charlotte died in 1818, though he may not have fully comprehended the loss. By the time George himself died in 1820, he had been king for almost 60 years. Yet for the last decade of his reign, he was king in name only. And so the man remembered by Americans as a tyrant was remembered in Britain as something else entirely, a tragic figure. A hard-working monarch undone by his own body and mind. It's worth pausing on that irony. The colonists painted George as a cruel despot, hungry for power, but in truth he was never an absolute ruler. He worked closely with ministers, respected Parliament, and believed deeply in duty. His downfall wasn't tyranny, but illness. Even his nickname, Mad King George, is a little unfair. He wasn't mad for his whole reign. For decades, he was perfectly sane, diligent, even dull. It was only in the later years that madness consumed him. But, of course, history tends to remember the spectacle, not the routine. Today, George III has become a strangely sympathetic figure in popular culture. He appears in plays, in novels, in television dramas. Sometimes he's a comic tyrant. Sometimes he's a tragic father. And sometimes, as in the musical Hamilton, he's reduced to a sneering caricature, singing cheeky breakup songs to America. But the real man was more complicated, conscientious, stubborn, unlucky, a monarch who wanted to be a steady parent to his people, and who ended his days more like a confused child himself. So, as you close your eyes tonight, picture him not in the trappings of madness, but in one of his gentler moments. A farmer king, strolling through his gardens at Windsor, inspecting turnips, speaking softly to his gardeners about the soil, trying, in his quiet way, to do his duty. And perhaps that's the truest image of George III. Not the tyrant, not the madman, but the earnest figure in the middle, always trying, often failing, and remembered best for what went wrong. George IV, the Regent King, hello again, traveller. Tonight our story remains in Britain, though it feels more like stepping into a theatre than a palace. Velvet curtains, gilded ceilings, endless banquets, and a monarch who loved performance. More than duty, our subject is George IV, Prince Regent King, a man of endless appetites, for food, for drink, for women, for clothes, for attention. If his father, George III, was a tragic figure of restraint and collapse, then George IV was his wild, indulgent opposite, excessive, flamboyant, and almost theatrical in his flaws. He was born in 1762, the eldest of George III's many children. From the start, young George was spoiled. He was intelligent and witty, but also lazy and easily distracted. Tutors complained that he would rather sketch, flirt, or dress himself up than study. He became fluent in French and Italian, but his favorite subject was always pleasure. By the time he was a teenager, he was already sliding into scandal. At 17, he was sneaking into London's theatres, drinking in clubs and racking up gambling debts. His father, the stern and dutiful George III, despaired. Here was the heir to the throne, careless, extravagant, unwilling to bear the weight of responsibility, and that pattern never really changed. In 1785, he secretly married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert. The marriage was illegal under English law. The heir to the throne couldn't marry a Catholic without Parliament's approval, but George ignored the rules. He was passionately attached to Maria for years, though he treated her badly and repeatedly abandoned her for others. His finances spiraled out of control. By his 20s, he owed more than $600,000, an astronomical sum. Parliament had to bail him out again and again just to keep him solvent. To soften public opinion, he agreed to a political marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick. That marriage was a disaster from the moment Caroline stepped off the ship. George found her vulgar and unkempt. She found him fat, drunk, and repulsive. They produced one child, Princess Charlotte, but otherwise avoided each other at all costs. George flaunted his mistresses. Caroline mocked him publicly. Their quarrels became a national scandal, splashed across newspapers and whispered about in coffeehouses. Meanwhile, George's taste for luxury only deepened. He built lavish palaces, Carlton House in London, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, filled with domes, minarets, and gilded oriental decor. He adored clothes. Bright waistcoats, jeweled snuff boxes, elaborate wigs. He ate like a king and drank like a sailor. His weight ballooned. He was nicknamed the Prince of Wales. And then, in 1811, his father's madness became permanent. George III was declared unfit to rule, and Parliament appointed George, now almost 50, as Prince Regent. For nearly a decade, Britain effectively had two kings, one locked in Windsor, raving into the void, and another dazzling society with endless parties. As regent, George enjoyed the title but loathed the responsibility. The Napoleonic Wars raged on, and he contributed little to their resolution. The heavy lifting was done by generals and ministers. Wellington beat Napoleon at Waterloo. Castlereagh brokered peace. George attended banquets, applauded from a safe distance, and then took credit when it was convenient. His domestic life was equally messy. Princess Charlotte, his only legitimate heir, died tragically young in childbirth in 1817. The nation mourned her as the people's princess, seeing in her the potential for a new, brighter monarchy. George, meanwhile, seemed more concerned with silencing his estranged wife, Caroline. When George finally became king in 1820, he tried to divorce Caroline publicly, accusing her of adultery. Parliament dragged her through a humiliating trial, but public sympathy swung to Caroline. She was seen as the wronged wife, while George looked like a cruel, bloated hypocrite. When Caroline tried to attend his coronation, the doors of Westminster Abbey were slammed shut in her face. She died just weeks later. George IV's actual reign was short, only 10 years, but his reputation was cemented. He was ridiculed in caricatures as a fat, overdressed buffoon. The satirists sketched him waddling through banquet halls, dripping jewels, and grasping for yet another glass of brandy. And yet, he wasn't entirely useless. For all his flaws, George IV left behind one undeniable legacy: art and architecture. He was a true patron of style. He funded John Nash's redesign of Buckingham Palace. He supported the completion of Windsor Castle's grand interiors. He collected paintings, sculptures, and furniture that today fill the royal collection. The Royal Pavilion in Brighton, though eccentric, remains one of Britain's most distinctive landmarks. His sense of theatrical taste reshaped London's cityscape, even if he bankrupted the treasury in the process. But personally, he ended in ruin. By the late 1820s, George was obese, gout-ridden, addicted to laudanum and alcohol. He could barely walk. He had to be lifted onto horseback by a mechanical hoist. His teeth rotted. His clothes had to be cut to fit around his swollen body. Ministers dreaded meetings with him, not only because of his moods, but because the smell of his decaying body was overwhelming. He spent his last years in Windsor and Windsor alone, surrounded by gilded furniture, mirrors, and fading memories of glamour. In 1830, at the age of 67, George IV died. He left behind no legitimate heirs. The throne passed to his younger brother, William IV. So what do we make of George IV? He was clever, charming, and occasionally witty, but he was also selfish, wasteful, and shallow. His reign produced little of substance, no great reforms, no heroic wars, no deep sense of duty, and yet he bequeathed to Britain a style, a glittering layer of culture that has endured. In the end, George IV is best remembered as a man who wore his crown like a costume, dazzling, excessive, and a little ridiculous. A king who treated monarchy not as duty, but as theatre, and perhaps that's why his memory lingers. He may not have been noble or wise, but he was unforgettable. So tonight, as you drift off, picture George IV not in his final, swollen misery, but in his heyday, stepping into a ballroom, jewels glinting, silk waistcoat shimmering, smiling just wide enough to charm the crowd, before slipping off to the corner table for yet another bottle of wine. The ending, closing the chronicle. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our long journey through kings and queens, through courts and crowns, through triumphs and tragedies. We have seen rulers who were wise and steady, and others who were vain and foolish. We've watched empires grow and crumble, palaces rise and decay, dynasties blossom and then wither away. Some monarchs clung fiercely to their thrones, others let the weight of the crown crush them. A few tried to lead their people, many simply tried to please themselves, but together they shaped the world we inherited. History, after all, is not a straight path. It's a winding road paved by flawed human beings. Kings and queens were not gods. They were men and women with tempers, hungers, fears, and fragile bodies. Some inspired loyalty, some inspired laughter, some inspired nothing at all. Yet each, in their own way, left fingerprints on the centuries. And perhaps that is why we tell their stories. Not because every monarch was great, but because every monarch was human. Behind the jewels and titles, behind the portraits and ceremonies, there were hearts that beat, minds that wandered, and lives that flickered out just as ours will someday. So tonight, as the final page closes and the last candle burns low, remember, history is not just the story of kings and queens. It is the story of people who stumbled, who rose, who dreamed, who failed, who tried. People not so very different from us. The crown passes on, but the lessons remain. And now, traveller, it is time to rest. May your dreams be lighter than the burdens of kings, and may tomorrow find you wiser for the stories of yesterday. Good night.